It's time to talk music, audio gear, and anything else that crosses our minds. I'm Mark.
And I'm Peter.
And welcome to the Hurton Audio Podcast. So, I had the luxury of being able to record drums in a professional recording studio just the other day. The studio in question is called Fairview, and they've had the likes of Def Leppard, Big Country, and John Parr recording there. So,
as well as a lot more, maybe a bit niche bands for worldwide audiences, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, the studio's based in the East Riding of Yorkshire. So it's not in like a big sort of city area. So it's like a countryside sort of one. Or it was at least when it started. But yeah, it was really fun because what we had the luxury of is enjoying a big array of microphones and preamps and like sort of the feeling of like an eclectic studio, even though it's not maybe like something akin to Abbey Road or one of the really big studios. What it does have is it has a really, really good sort of history. Which I think is really interesting because for me that is a big draw with a lot of the studios is who's been there, what's been made there, and why would you go there?
I believe the vast majority of the studio has been sort of untouched since the 70s, I want to say. It looks very 70s on the inside. And that was, as you say, part of the charm. You know, there was obviously some differences, like we was recorded into Cubase, but also into a different software called Radar, which was really interesting. But the actual equipment like collection there is very impressive in the hardware, like sort of 19-inch rack format stuff and preamps. There was a lot of selection, which was really cool because, you know, everybody, you know, at home, people tend to record with just their regular interfaces, which sound pretty good for the most part. And then I think people who are really, really, really into it branch out and get some dedicated mic pre's, like in 500 series or 19-inch rack format, or even desktop ones, because there's some desktop ones coming out now where, or like 2-channel interfaces by SSL or like by...
Neve's just brought one out, haven't they? They've brought out a mini interface with a screen and stuff, and then they've also brought out a 19-inch rack interface that's, I think, 2-channel or something.
Yeah.
It's either 2 or 8, I can't quite remember.
It's becoming a lot more popular because people are realising that people want, or the companies are realising that people want like a 2-channel interface with 2 really good pre's in, and that's all some people need. You know, if you're not recording a drum kit, you don't really need more than 2 channels in.
Yeah, stereo and mono is about as much as you need for almost all instruments. I mean, there's very few occasions where, you know, like when you talk about just necessity recording, where stereo is not going to cut it. I mean, you can even record drums with just a stereo overhead. It's just that it doesn't give you many options. That is the main thing with it. But yeah, Fairview had a lot of cool stuff to play with, and microphone wise, we got the pleasure of having a Sennheiser 441 on the snare drum, which was really, really nice. And we got to look at some of like the mic techniques and decisions made, which was very cool. Obviously, the thing is to remember with a lot of studios, even when you're watching studio documentaries, is a lot of the decision making is to do with the size of the room, what the room is like, what the microphones are like in that room. So it's almost like you'd never be able to make what you can make in a specific space and studio because you'd have to have an identical space with all the identical equipment, and that's just not going to happen, is it?
Yeah, and one of the most informative things was just like the way that he prepared, because we had an engineer called John who was, you know, engineering everything, because obviously you can walk into a studio and you can be like, yeah, I know how to do all this studio stuff, but navigating somebody else's like system in terms of like this was a very hardware forward system, and just because it was on Cubase didn't mean that anybody who's familiar with Cubase could just jump on and record. So that was a eye-opening experience as well, because you would have thought you could just go, well, I know how all this stuff works, let me just jump in.
And obviously the radar thing would have thrown us through a loop if we was doing it by ourselves. You'd have gone, why do we need to go through radar first? And then that would have really threw a spanner in the works for like getting used to the system. I mean, it's bad enough when you're having to change all your inputs and outputs and try and figure out how the studio is sort of rigged up behind the scenes, but adding another program like that was very unexpected.
And his experience and his expertise is really what give going there like so much value for money, because, you know, there'd be simple things like the way that he'd treat the drums to make sure the drums sounded good in the room, which is something, you know, we've seen people say this on Mixed with the Masters and stuff, and it is pretty obvious information, but there's knowing how to address it. If you've got snare ring, or, you know, how can you tell if your drums are the right sort of, you know, tightness on the each skin? And sometimes they don't want to be tight. Sometimes one skin wants to be tight and one wants to be loose. That's a popular thing I've seen people do. And then obviously bass drum treatment. That was another thing that was, you know, very important when we was doing the drum sound. So there was a lot of really, really interesting learning experiences there in terms of how to capture a drum kit. And, you know, we like to think of ourselves as quite experienced in recording, and technically we are, because we've been doing it so long, we've done so much recording, but it was really nice to sort of see somebody else's process doing it. And, you know, it's not so much like watching somebody on YouTube show you how they do it. It's like being in the room with your stuff and your ideas.
Yeah, I think that's the other thing. In person with your, say, with my drum kit, you know, it's not a hypothetically, what would you do with this kit? It's, okay, we've got this kit in the room, this is what we're going to do with it. So I had a more stripped down drum kit that only had a snare, 2 toms, the bass drum, and 3 cymbals and a hi-hat. So, you know, which is pretty standard, but obviously I have a little bit more stuff than that when we're recording in our studio. So it was nice just to make it a little bit more simple, and obviously get more space to make the drums up, and also a quicker setup time, because we did very well when we got there to have the drum kit set up in about 25 minutes. So we was pretty impressed with ourselves, weren't we?
Yeah, because if we would have taken like over an hour to set the drum kit up, then it would have taken so much more time to mic it. And, you know, there were certain elements of the drum kit that needed to be taken down again to be like tweaked, like the snare and the kick. So, you know, that's when you start battling the clock, because, you know, when you go to a studio, you know, if you record music in your house, you've got infinite time and it doesn't really matter. In like a professional setting, it's like, right, from the moment you arrive at the door, you're technically on the clock, and each decision you make is going to affect how much you actually get done. And we was quite ambitious. We wanted to record 6 tracks of drums, and luckily we managed to just get 6 tracks of drums done. And you was rattling through them at one point, weren't you? In the midsection, you was like knocking the tracks down really fast.
Even though it was starting to get to the last hour and we were still opening like the final session, if you think like we had the drum kit set up in 25 minutes, some of the songs we did 2 takes on. So we did a total of 6 to 10 minutes recording time. You know, including setup, of course. That is not very long to record drums in that environment, and we still were starting to run out of time. So say if I walked in and started struggling, or I wasn't finding some of the tracks as easy as others, particularly the first 4 tracks I had no problems with. The last 2 was slightly different, and it took us a while, not like a long amount of time, but it just took us a little bit of working out to make sure I had the parts down and the arrangement down. But that was luckily near the end, so we didn't have to worry about it. We only had 1 or 2 tracks left to record. But, you know, if you struggled with the first 2 tracks, you would find yourself quickly running out of time in that environment. And I think a lot of people, when they book studios, some people are very prepared. We were sort of like prepared in a sense that we had a lot of organisation, but not prepared in the sense that we hadn't rehearsed, like physically playing the songs and physically acting out the songs. We knew what we was going to do, but like I hadn't sat there and practiced the songs on drums. And that's mainly because that tends to be the way we operate a lot of the time, is we tend to just learn the arrangement when we're recording and take it seriously when we're recording.
And also we deliberately made sure we didn't have the most technically challenging songs to record as well.
Yeah. The songs, we programmed quite simple drum guides so that there wasn't anything too technical to trip up on. And what we didn't want is we didn't want me to constantly be going, which section is next? You know, like if there's like 15 sections in a track. But yeah, even so, even with very, very simple drum parts, it still felt quite difficult, particularly I'm used to doing more like 1 or 2 songs a day. So to do 6 by the halfway point, it was starting to take a physical toll because you're not just playing 6 songs through once. You're having to set the kit up, sound check. Obviously, the sound check takes a long time. Then sort of get everything happy, and then you're having to do a practice run and then maybe record 2 to 3 takes, which once again isn't that much compared to what a lot of people end up doing. Some people end up having to do songs 10, 20 times, which I personally think is a waste of time. But you know, if that's the way you like to record drums, that's the way you like to record drums. I am the sort of person who is inclined to get it hopefully in 1 take, but within 2 to 3 takes, 2 to 5, really under 5 if I'm being realistic. But ideally for me, I'm happy if I can get it in 2 to 3 takes.
It's the sooner the better, really, is the idea. Because also, if you're in a space, the more you agonise over it, the less you're going to get done, and the less really, like we were saying, value for money. Like that's what we was curious about. Is like how can we get the most out of this session? And I think we did that. With the only way we could have done more, as we were saying, is if I would have recorded the bass in tandem with Mark on drums, but we was worried that would have been just too complicated in terms of trying to figure out who had the best takes on which takes and you know, all the interplay. So, and then we'd also have to set bass amp and everything up as well, which we thought we'll just get the drums done, because guitars are very easy to record at home. Drums are a lot more challenging, but also drums use a lot more equipment. Like a guitar, most of the time is a DI or 1 mic, you know, now.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people have gone off miking amps anyway. A lot of people have you've seen a really big increase in amp in a pedal sort of equipment, and then even Kemper have released a pedal profile, as I've seen on the JHS show. So you can just have your full amp modeler just in a pedal, which is crazy that the technology is getting that way. But the thing is with guitar recording is the second you start making up a guitar amp, you're having a lot of room interplay and margin for error with the tone. So I think some of the all-in-one systems, like say the UAD pedals, like the Dream, Guitar Rig even to a sense, and like say rack guitar units that have like the all-in-one tone and amp simulation, they're just a lot more faithful to the sound you're trying to get in the studio than putting a microphone on an amp.
That's the other thing as well. A lot of these pedals are designed to sit in a mix. They're designed to be recorded, like, because that's the reason why they've been made. You know, anybody can like crank an amp in a room, and there's people who really, really love the feeling of like the amp, like in the low end of the amp, like in the room, shaking them, and like all the like the physical air moving is something people talk about a lot. But again, a lot of that magic gets cut straight out of the mix. Like people just high pass the guitars if there's too much low end, because it interferes with the bass and the kicks. So like if you recording, and recording is your main like thing when you're playing guitar, really these amp in the boxes are already getting you, like, they're getting you most of the way to your mix sound. Whereas if you use a mic on an amp, as you say, there's so many different factors to consider. But then everything you're trying to capture realistically is, a lot of it's going to get mixed out unless you're playing some really, really wide open sort of music where it's a drum kit and a guitar and maybe a bass, and that's it in your mix.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I think a lot of that sound, if you're going in there with keyboards or multi-layers or any acoustic instrumentation, I think a lot of that sound is going to get EQ'd out, basically.
So there's a big difference between how, say, we use our DAW and information and stuff. So what we tend to do when we're recording is we tend to have a lot of visual aids. We're always in the control room. So both of us, when we're recording, we can see Cubase, we can see the arrangement. We have color-coded blocks that tell us the chorus is coming up next, the bridge is coming up next, marker tracks, everything. All these visual aids that really help when you're recording to boost your confidence in this is the next section. What Fairview had was none of that for me when I was playing drums. So I was relying. Luckily, we brought very in-depth guide tracks that had guide vocals in, so I could follow along with the arrangement, like just in ears. But even so, it's nice to know what section's coming up, and it's very easy when you're in the middle of recording to go, is it 8 more bars to the next section, or is the bridge next, or is the solo next? So that was the main difficult thing for me, because you get used to your habits and what you rely on, like signal wise for recording. And like I say, I always like to have a full backing track in my ears when I'm recording drums, because you get a feel for what it's going to sound like, but also for what you're playing to. I don't know how people, because you do see people a lot of the time record drums with just a click.
Yeah, that amazes me, to be honest, just on the how you have to process everything in your brain and the confidence you have to have in the arrangement. And again, it's a bit like what you were saying though, Mike. If you rehearse and if you're musically trained or classically trained in terms of, performance, you will just count out the bars and everything, or you might even have a chart that has your arrangement on, and you may just play through the chart like naturally, and that's like a different skill in itself to what we're sort of talking about, which is just playing like a song just straight off the vibe and not really thinking in a technical manner about the performance, just trying to do what you can do with the song provided, which I think is very valid, because a lot of classic albums, they're sort of figuring out how to play the album or how to even write the album in the studio. And I suppose that's the thing that we enjoy playing with, because that way there's so much more fun in the studio, because you walk into a session and anything's possible. Whereas if you would have rehearsed every fill and every beat and every different part going to Fairview, we might have got the tracks done slightly faster, but it would have been all set in stone already, essentially.
But also, if you've done that and then say the talkback comes in and go, maybe less fills, then you go, but hang on, I've been practicing this for weeks, You don't want to be stubborn.
Thing, yeah.
So what we was very flexible when we went to Fairview. We was open to any ideas, open to, like say when I was drumming, there was a few times where we did a take, and in the control room from Peter and John was maybe tone down the drum fills, maybe do a little less. Maybe if you're gonna do a drum fill, do a more succinct drum fill with less going on. So, and that actually really helped. And I ended up doing that on some of the tracks, and we ended up with tighter drum takes, but also that had a little bit of personality, but not overzealous in a way where it was messy. So, it's quite interesting when you're doing that in real time and taking that feedback and stuff. What you don't want to be, in my opinion, is very stubborn when you go somewhere like a recording studio. When you go to a studio, you're going for their process and for their input. If you go to a studio and you want to do everything your way, just do it at home or do it in a practice space. Do you know what I mean?
I think that's the thing, because ultimately, like we were saying, coming from a production background, we could have argued about all the mics on the kit. We could have argued about which preamps and how we wanted things EQing, but that wouldn't have helped us, and it wouldn't have helped him. It would have slowed everybody down. And just because we think a mic might suit an instrument, or even we wanted to try, like we were saying, I don't think we actually had any Neumanns on the kit, and there was a bunch of Neumanns there, and that's what we was partially excited about. But again, if putting a Neumann on the snare meant we got tons of hi-hat bleed and slowed the session down, because it was like, well, how can we place it so we don't get as much bleed? Or, it's a nice mic, but it doesn't sound good on that kit in, where it was. We would have lost a lot of time, and we would have probably also sort of like dampened the atmosphere a bit because it would have been putting everybody outside the comfort zone. And that's where, the process comes in. If you're going somewhere and getting somebody to work with you, but also they know the room, they know the mics, they know the console and the pre's and how they've done it before. You walk in there, you don't know any of that. You just think, oh, this mic's expensive. I want to hear it on the snare. So we really did bite our tongues. There was a couple of things in there that we didn't get a chance to use that we really wanted to use. But we was trying to think smart, how do we get the most value out of this? And you go with the process and you go with essentially the direction from your engineer. Your engineer in there knows that room way better than you. And it sort of does need repeating because it's one of those things where it's you can have the best intentions, but the best way to do it sometimes is to just let somebody else do their thing and let them relax doing their thing and be confident in doing their thing. And we walked out of there when we got the sessions in our home studio, in our Cubase. The drum sound is really, really good, and it's got no plugins on at the moment. And that's not saying it won't need any mixing, but in terms of capturing a drum sound, we've got a really, really, really nicely captured and sort of semi-mixed drum sound already.
And it's got a really cool 70s studio flavour to it as well, because of the equipment that's been used and the style of miking. Because that's the other thing that's really cool is instead of getting a really modern take on drum recording, what we got was a very old school take on drum recording, which is what you want when you go to a studio like Fairview, is you want something a little bit more vintage, and that's what we got. So that's what's really interesting about it. What we got was that we got a lot of the room sound. We had AEA ribbons in the second room that was being used as a room mic. We had ribbons, like a Coles ribbon mic over the top of the kit. We had everything about the mic placement was very much like recording in a 70s studio. Do you know what I mean? Even though some of the mics were more modern, it's the way that the sensibilities of John in Fairview, because he did a lot of old sessions in the 80s and stuff.
Primarily 80s and 90s.
So he had, but when he started recording on tape. So he has that side of sort of the production, which is really cool because on Sonic Highways, there's this battle, isn't there, between pre-digital and post-digital recording. So what was really cool was being able to see firsthand, somebody who is pre-DAW recording, even though we was recording on Cubase, his full approach was old school. You know what I mean?
And it was all the drums went through Neve 1073 or SSL pre's. I think there were G series pre's, the SSL ones, or some compressors, some EQs, just all sorts. So we got a very, very processed and I mean, I wouldn't say saturated, but the drum sound was very, very processed by all the gear, which was again something we wanted. We didn't want to go there and record a super, super dry, no effects drum sound. We can do that at home. So that's the thing. And also, it wasn't just using Neves. It was having somebody who uses Neve preamps all the time and knows how to dial them in, with a lot of the different EQs across the room that he was actually dialing in, which I could actually see him on some of them just patch them in and dial in whatever he wanted for the snare or whatever. You could, being in the control room, I could hear him tackling either the ring or bringing the brightness up or making sure it was punchy on each individual drum. And that's the thing that was so sort of great from the production background, because it's you're not just recording something, you're having somebody engineer, and I think engineering is something that it's a bit of a lost art, because we were saying most of the colleges really, they want you to record things dry, or you are often told if you commit to a really, really aggressive compressor on the way in, you are making it unflexible. Whereas if you record with no effects, you can do anything in the box. You can reamp, you can you can dial it really heavily, or you can dial it back because it's all in the box, it's all non-committed and it's all flexible. And that definitely, especially when you're learning, has a lot of benefits. But in terms of capturing a sound and having it sound good on the way in, so you don't have to use as many plugins or you don't have to try as hard when you're mixing it, that is a different art form in itself, and it does require a certain degree of confidence.
Yeah, and also it's an immediate thing. Like when I was listening through my drum takes after playing them, I was obviously listening to more of a mixed sound, which helps a lot because you could hear like the oomph in some of the instruments, like the kick and the snare. So you know, the only downside was something like Fairview is because we're so used to listening to our monitor speakers, which are Focal Alpha 50s. It was hard to think about what does it sound like in our room versus what it currently sounds like in his room, because he had different monitors. He had a different room, everything. So you get very used to listening to music in a particular way. So it's interesting because they do sound more like I thought they would sound when we listen to them on our monitors at home. But in all fairness, that's because we know what these monitors sound like. So, but I you know, you get used to that when you listen to multiple monitors. But I was very critical of my my performances the full time. So I was listening with like dread and fear, trying to hear, have I made a mistake here and there, as opposed to like enjoying the process and the sound design. That's the only problem when you're performing in the studio. Depending on how critical you are and what you're going for, because I was playing to a click, I was trying to be on the click the full time. I wasn't trying to sway away from the click or do anything wild with the tempo. So that was for me like the hardest part, was just making sure I was on the click. But in all fairness, I think whenever you've got a drum and a click and the drums are really loud and the click's really loud and you can't really hear much else, you've got nothing else to focus on. Whereas when you start embedding that drum slightly behind the music, it suddenly sounds a lot more in time.
Yeah, because you know it's not as in your face, and also like we were saying as well, you was playing to completely sequenced tracks on some of the tracks. Some of the tracks we had guard bass or guard guitars in, but a lot of them were like fully sequenced, and that's the other thing. A lot of them aren't going to be sequenced when we record them, so things naturally fall into place a bit more. But also the I think you scrutinise your recordings a lot more, especially when you sit down and you have to just listen through your take.
Yeah.
It's a lot easier to sit there and scrutinise it when you do it like that than it is leaving it a day.
Yeah, because you're having to think, right, is it good enough for me to go do another one, or are we happy enough with it to move on to the next song? And like I said, the scary thing is when you're in a studio environment is that time crunch. If you're thinking, I want to do 10 songs, and you've taken 4 hours to get the first 2 done, it starts being a very daunting task. And because of the nature of how you have to set the kit up, mic it up, test everything, make sure everybody's happy with everything, it does take a lot of time to set up the drum kit and have it fully mic'd. So it's not like, right, you've walked in, we're going to record for 7 hours. It's like we're going to set up for half the time, or you're like a third of the time. And then you've got to record in this middle section before we start packing down. Yeah. So it's very easy to think, I've got another 3 hours of recording drums, when you've really got only like another hour and a half or 2 hours sort of in the middle of it. So we did very well to time ourselves through the day and to be quick and to be organised. Whereas I do worry for anybody who's not organised or quick, it would be a very difficult task to even do 6 drum tracks.
We didn't have a lunch break either. That's the other thing.
We didn't
some
stop.
People could have gone out for lunch and been like, right, we're going to go get a pasty, and come back, and you would have been like, right, you're going home.
Yeah, we didn't stop at all. So we just wanted to make sure we got what we wanted to do done. Luckily for us, we did. But like I said, that was, even with all that organisation and me being pretty rock solid in playing the tracks all the way through without mistakes, the first song we had to punch in on was the 5th song. So the first 4 we didn't punch in any of the takes, which is pretty impressive really, because a lot of people struggle to play the entire song in one go now. And that's what he was actually saying before we booked it. Like, are we confident playing? Can we play the full song in a row? Are we used to playing to a click? And these are all the things you've got to consider if you're ever thinking about going to a studio. Because if you've never played to a click before, try practicing at a friend's house who has Cubase and a microphone or something. See how tight you are. Get an app. Use a MIDI drum and see, can you play on a MIDI drum to a click enough? Do you know what I mean? Because if you can, it's really challenging. Now, obviously, if you can't play to a click at all, just scrap the click completely and don't use it.
Yeah, but just completely. I think that's a better approach. If a click's going to be a barrier, just freehand it essentially, and you will end up with better results.
But then you don't have as much options when you're comping the two takes together.
Yeah, you basically can't edit it if you do it freehand.
So that's your drawbacks. But yeah, that was our experience at recording at Fairview Studios, and we really had a fun time.
And in summary, I would recommend, if you can afford to go to like a studio with some heritage, or even just at one of the new studios that, like our production suite, if you are feeling a bit like the recording process or the production process for you is a little bit stale, or you want to mix it up, it's definitely something to try. Because what we found is there was things that was a lot more beneficial for, but things that for us were a bit more challenging. And that's why when you can come back into your studio and think, okie doke, right, these are the areas where this is like a better experience, but here are the areas where maybe we could either improve your home studio setup, or maybe it's one of those where you go, well, if there's a particular song or, say, a client that comes in, maybe it's that you need to go do one section like drums or vocals in an external place for the sound and the expertise. But I would highly recommend it if it's something that you're interested in and something that you can afford.
Yeah, and on that, though, thanks for listening, everybody. We'll see you next week.